Good afternoon and welcome to the part three of human resources. And that this is the module that we're going to start continue to talk about. And eventually, when we're done with it, we're going to move on to a different module. So this is what I have been saying, and it has been a recurring theme for some time. So let's get into the human resources module. So this is the home page. You must have seen it quite a few times as you have been maybe following my videos. And I want to make sure that we start talking about how you configure the system. So within the finance and operation, you go into the human resources module. Right underneath the setup, there's human resource parameters and human resources shared parameters. The difference between the two is basically one simple thing. Human resource parameters, anything that you configure in this system or anything that you've set up in this system is only applicable to one legal entity which you're working on, which is BRMF in this case. Whereas human resources share parameters, whatever you configure there will be shared right across all legal entities. So if you have more than one legal entity, in this case, anything that goes in or gets configured in the shared parameters is applicable to all legal entities. Simplest example to differentiate between, to give you a pictorial view of it, is basically going into workers. So if you look at employees, employees would be only the employees applicable to BRMF organization or the legal entity. Whereas if you click on workers, you will see a bigger list compared to the employees one, because the workers are being captured from all legal entities. So that is the difference between human resource parameters and the shared parameters. And everywhere you see a shared parameter or something shared, that means it's global. And that is a universal theme across finance and operations. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what you're configuring and where it's going to have an impact. And that's a very common thing in other modules that we're going to start talking about eventually. So as you go into the human resource parameters, there are quite a few parameters that we will want to touch base on, but today I'm going to simply talk about the most common ones within the general, and then I'll create some more videos to talk a little bit in more detail about other parameters that we need to set up. So in my implementations, I have seen quite a few common ones that are being used across the human resource module. But I'll also touch base on some of the ones that are not being used as much, but for your references, it's just easier to make sense and be aware of it. So absence color codes and the integration to absence and absence code, these are applicable to, of course, leave of absence module. So we haven't touched the leave of absence module just yet, but you can have color coding, you can have a chart, for instance, like a calendar, and then in your manager self-service workspace, you have the ability to have these different color codes based on different reason codes and different plans, and you can have all that configured into a leave of absence. And as a manager, you can open up that calendar and see how many people, how many of your resources are leaving, and then you'll know exactly by the color coding what is the reason for them to leave. And that way you can plan your resources accordingly. In terms of the injury and illness, I have seen that quite a bit, especially in the construction industry, of course. There tends to happen a lot of accidents, a lot of incidents. So you want to make sure that you keep the case incidents open all the time, and the number of days that you want to retain that record. So in some cases, people or the organizations don't want to keep their record for more than 3 years, and that I've seen that quite a bit. So in this case, when you turn this toggle button on, you put a number of days, 3 years, so number of days would be equivalent to three years. You can do your math, 367, I guess, 365 times 3, whatever the math comes out to be. That is your number of days that you're going to keep the record, and after that it's going to disappear. So not too much I've seen in other organizations except the contractors or the constructions, and constructions of course make sense. The most common ones that I have actually seen being used the most are, of course, default identification number. So when you're hiring an employee, you don't want to keep selecting what should be their identification number, right? So in here, you can configure it to be driver's license. That's the most common one I've seen, and your social insurance number. So in Canada, it's social insurance number. In US, is social security number. So these are the two default identification numbers that I have seen. So when you hire an employee, you don't necessarily always have to select a driver's license. You can simply input their driver's license. Same thing with default employment categories. So you could have different kind of employment categories based on your organization. So your client could say that a hourly employees could be a category that I would like to differentiate between my employees. Or you can have a full-time or a part-time category as well. So it really depends on the need of reporting and the need of your organization, how they want to categorize their employees. Same thing with the contractor. So when you're hiring a contractor, this is the default category that you would apply to them. So in this case, I would normally would leave it open, just because you don't want to default it. You won't always be hiring a full-time employee, a salary employee. So for that reason, you want to make sure that you leave it open and make it mandatory. So when an HR manager is actually hiring, they would need to select one of these categories, and then that way they can belong to that category. Same thing with the default employment type. So under employment type, I don't have anything configured, but a lot of times I've seen full-time and part-time, which is the most common ones, or regular full-time or regular part-time, for instance. So these are some of the types, employment types that I've seen in my configuration. And same thing as the category, you don't wouldn't want to default it unless it's absolutely required, or unless your client says that I'm okay with it, default it to something, and then I will change it. It's my responsibility. But normally I advise against it. Recent hires date range. So this is applicable to the manager self-service workspace. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I encourage you to go into the employee self-service workspace, for instance, assign yourself as an employee, go into your ESS, and then make sure that you have somebody reporting to you. So now you become a manager and you have the access to the manager self-service workspace, and see who was recently hired in within the 7 days, and you just get to see that number. And then if you start drilling into it, you'll get to see the record as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that later in the videos. So recent hire data is applicable to that dashboard. Same thing with view exiting workers date range. So I have configured it as 7 days, and this basically shows the managers who is exiting. So within 7 days from now, who's exiting. And then if I want to show their name and whatnot, so I can also tell them that, okay, who's reporting directly to me, show me that employee or employees, or who are indirectly showing or reporting to me. So indirect reporting would be like a dotted line reporting. So if somebody's on a project with me and they're reporting to me indirectly, so I just simply want to know if who's exiting from that team. So that can also be configured in the system. So just make sure that this is a human resource parameter, so it's only applicable to the PRMF. Exited workers, so same thing, it goes under a dashboard, and you get to see who has exited uh, recently within the 7 days. So you can obviously change the days, the number of days of the period, and there are months, years, and you can make it all. So all would probably just lower down your performance, but normally days has been the most applicable. So who has exited the organization uh, for 7 days, and this ties down to the exiting workers. So you want to make sure that you want to either select direct only or extended report, or view exiting workers as none, so everybody would end up showing. Termination defaults, you don't want to select this. So I also always advise against it, just because if you're terminating an employee based on performance, for instance, you don't want to rehire them at some point unless they have improved, significantly improved, and you have an actual case where they demonstrate that they have improved. So you might want to rehire them. But as a default toggle button, I would say you keep it uh, as no. And then at any point when you're terminating an employee, the HR manager should make some notes on their end and then turn on this toggle button for their profile. So every time you rehire them again, this toggle button will allow you to access those notes. Payment methods, not very applicable to be honest, because in all my implementation, the payment methods have been the electronic fund transfers, which we have actually, with the technical resource built in. So that's been the story for past couple of years of my implementation. And we'll always have a third party vendor who has the payroll system set up for the organization, and we simply want to send them the flat file. So you need a technical resource to do that. So never have actually personally used any of these payment methods. Unless there's a bigger process involved, then of course you enable these. But in my case, I haven't actually utilized any of these toggles, any of those two. Expiring records range. So this has to do with certifications, for instance, or some sort of courses perhaps that may be expiring. So an organization asks individuals to have a CPR certification. So this of course goes into the manager self-service workspace. When you go into that, you'll get to see who whose names and what's the range of expiring records that you would see, and you get to even select what kind of records here you want to see. So an example is like a CPR record. So if somebody is reporting directly to me who has CPR certification and it's expiring within 7 days, it will show up on my manager self-service workspace. Same thing with the expired records whose CPR record has been expired, so I need to do follow up for that. And years of service displays. So there are three different kinds that you could use. So employment start date, adjusted start date, or seniority. Seniority comes in with union workers that I've seen quite a bit, and the employment start date is the most common one that I've seen. So this would only get to show on the employee record. So if you go into the employee record, then you get to see this in action. Basically, it's just a number of years based on what you could figure. And the last one is the address change. So you have a historical record of address change, and the number of days we've configured is 7. So we'll get to see anyone who has changed their address within the 7 days, and that's the toggle button, or that's the text field basically that allows you to do that. And I haven't personally used it, and not many organizations care to have uh, an indication of how many people have changed their addresses. They only care as long as the address has been updated and up to date, just because they need to send their T4s sometimes. So not a lot of organizations send it out through email, but they send it out a paper format. So that's why address is applicable and should be updated all the time. So with that, I will close this video, and we're going to start talking about recruitment and compensation in the next one. While we're talking about the recruitment, I have quite a few students who come up to me and professionals who want to get into this workspace, and they have asked me to help them out, and I tend to help them out quite a bit. So if you need any help, of course, I will put a link down on the description. Click on it. I'm happy to provide some services to you to get into the space, to give you some insights on how to get certified, what things to look into, and I'm happy to help you get into the space in the Dynamics 365. It's a growing space, and I would be happy to actually connect with you. So do make sure that look into the description, click on the link, and it will take you to my page, and we can connect there.